My mother sold her ancestral home 10 years ago to fund my husband's dreams, keeping it a secret to save his pride. Today, he left her to die on our sofa because he didn't want to get old people germs in his new Range Rover. But here's what he forgot. I track money for a living. By the time my mother woke up from surgery, I had already frozen every penny he stole from her. He's about to find out that the woman he called worthless was the only reason he wasn't sleeping on the street. Let me tell you how it all began. The California sun has a way of making everything look perfect, even when the foundations are rotting underneath. That Sunday morning in our Newport Beach home was no different. The light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the $20,000 Italian marble floors that my mother, Martha, had spent the last hour hand-polishing with organic beeswax. She's 65, with a heart that's been through more than most, yet she refused to let a cleaning crew touch her house. She believed in the dignity of work, the old-school American way. I watched her from the kitchen island, her small frame bent over the buffing cloth, while Jonathan stood by the grand entrance, checking his reflection in the antique gilded mirror. He was the picture of success: a custom-tailored linen suit, a $3,000 watch, and a smile that had sold millions in luxury real estate. But to me, in that moment, he looked like a stranger. The silence was broken by a sharp, wet gasp. I turned just in time to see my mother's hand fly to her chest, her face turning a terrifying shade of gray. The beeswax cloth slipped from her fingers, landing on the marble she'd just perfected. She didn't scream. She didn't want to be a bother. She just sank onto the velvet sofa, her breathing coming in ragged, shallow whistles that sounded like dry leaves scraping against pavement. "Mom? Mom!" I was across the room in a heartbeat, my knees hitting the hard floor. Her skin was clammy, cold as the Pacific in January. "Jonathan, something's wrong. Call 911." Jonathan didn't move. He didn't even put down his golf glove. He looked at his watch, then at my mother, then back at his reflection. A flicker of annoyance, not concern, but pure, unadulterated irritation, crossed his face. "Nicole, for heaven's sake, don't overreact. She probably just had too much coffee. I have a 10 a.m. tea time with the Sterling Group. This is a $5 million listing on the line." "She can't breathe, Jonathan," I screamed, my voice cracking. "Give me your keys. Mine are blocked in by your new Range Rover. I need to get her to Hoag Hospital right now." Jonathan's grip tightened on his golf bag. He looked at the gleaming white SUV sitting in the driveway, his pride and joy, the symbol of his self-made empire. Then he looked at my mother, who was now clutching the sofa cushion, her eyes rolling back in her head. "In the Rover?" he asked, his voice dripping with a chilling, clinical disdain. "Nicole, do you have any idea how much those leather seats cost? I'm not getting old people germs or whatever fluid she's about to leak into my car. She's been a burden, sucking the life out of this house since the day she moved in. If she's that bad, call an ambulance. I'm not ruining my morning or my interior for someone who doesn't even know how to take care of herself." He didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel, the silver keys jingling in his hand like a taunt. I heard the roar of the V8 engine, a sound that usually meant prosperity, but now sounded like a predator's growl. As the gravel crunched under his tires, leaving us behind, a terrifyingly cold stillness settled over me. In my professional life as a director of audit and compliance, I am paid to find the rot in the numbers. I am trained to remain calm when everyone else is panicking, to look past the polish and see the fraud. For 10 years, I had audited Fortune 500 companies, but I had failed to audit my own marriage. As the distant wail of an ambulance finally cut through the pristine quiet of our gated community, I leaned into my mother's ear. "I've got you, Mom. I've got you." But inside, my mind was already shifting. The grief was there, but the auditor was taking over. I thought about the $80,000 we had saved for our future. I thought about the way Jonathan had suddenly started hiding his phone. And I remembered the way my mother had insisted on giving him a loan 10 years ago. Money I thought came from her small savings, but now seeing the cruelty in Jonathan's eyes, I realized it was something much deeper. Jonathan thought he was leaving a helpless old woman and a grieving wife. He thought he was the king of the castle. What he didn't realize was that he had just handed a professional investigator the only motive she ever needed to tear his life apart, piece by piece, ledger by ledger. "He's going to pay, Mom," I whispered as the paramedics burst through the door. "He's going to pay for every single breath you're struggling to take right now. And I'm going to make sure he doesn't have a cent left to buy a bottle of water, let alone a Range Rover." The door slammed shut behind us as they loaded her into the ambulance. The perfect Sunday was over. The audit had begun. If you've ever felt like your kindness was taken for granted by someone you loved, hit that like button. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from. I need your strength for what comes next. The waiting room at Hoag Hospital smelled of industrial-strength bleach and the kind of stale coffee that only exists in places where people wait for bad news. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a persistent, nagging vibration that felt like it was drilling directly into my skull. Across the room, a television was muted, showing a weather report for Southern California. Sunny, 75 degrees. A perfect day for golf. I sat on a plastic chair that felt as cold and unyielding as my husband's heart. My hands were still trembling, not just from the shock of my mother's collapse, but from the searing memory of Jonathan's face as he drove away. He looked at her like she was a stain on his expensive upholstery. To calm my nerves, I reached for my mother's purse, a sturdy, sensible leather bag she'd carried for a decade. It was organized with the precision of a woman who had lived through the lean years and learned that everything had its place. I needed to find her insurance card, her ID, something to give the intake nurse. But as I zipped open the interior pocket, my fingers brushed against something that didn't feel like a wallet. It was a weathered, yellowed manila envelope, tucked deep behind her checkbook. On the front, in her elegant, old-fashioned cursive, were 3 words that made my breath hitch. "For Nicole's future." My heart hammered against my ribs as I slid the documents out. I expected to find a modest life insurance policy, or perhaps the title to her old sedan. Instead, I found a settlement statement from a title company in Santa Barbara, dated exactly 10 years ago. I felt the world tilt. The document detailed the sale of my grandmother's Victorian home, the house where I'd taken my first steps, the house with the wraparound porch and the rose garden my mother had tended for 40 years. It was our family's legacy, the American dream carved into wood and stone. I had been told she sold it because the taxes were too high, that she wanted to downsize to be closer to me. But as I flipped to the final page, I saw a copy of a cashier's check. It was for $250,000, and it wasn't made out to a savings account or a retirement fund. It was made out to Nelson Luxury Realty. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. 10 years ago, Jonathan was a struggling junior agent with a big mouth and an empty bank account. He had come home one night, suddenly flush with private investment capital, claiming he'd impressed a silent partner who believed in his vision. That money was the foundation of everything we had now: the Newport mansion, the luxury cars, the designer suits he wore like armor. He hadn't built an empire. He had cannibalized my mother's life. A memory flashed in my mind, vivid and painful. It was the night Jonathan opened his own firm. We were celebrating at a high-end steakhouse. My mother had been there, sitting quietly at the end of the table, smiling as Jonathan raised a glass of expensive Napa Cabernet and toasted to his own hard work and grit. I remembered her catching his eye, a silent, knowing look passing between them. Jonathan had winked at her and whispered something I couldn't hear. Now I knew what it was. He had convinced her to stay silent. He had played on her old-school values, the belief that a woman should support the men in her family, that a husband's pride was a sacred thing that shouldn't be bruised by the truth of where his success came from. She had sacrificed her only asset, her childhood home, her security, just so her son-in-law could feel like a big man. And how had he repaid that investment? By calling her a burden. by refusing to let her old people germs touch the leather seats she had essentially paid for, by leaving her to die on a sofa because he didn't want to miss a tea time with potential clients, who wouldn't even like him if they knew who he really was. A cold, surgical rage began to replace the fear in my chest. I am an auditor. I deal in facts, in trails of evidence, in the cold reality of the ledger. For years, I had looked at our life and seen a success story. But now, I saw the fraud. Jonathan Nelson was a bankrupt soul living on borrowed time and stolen capital. Mrs. Wood? I looked up. A surgeon in blue scrubs was standing in the doorway, his expression weary but kind. "Your mother is out of surgery," he said, wiping his brow. "It was a close call. The blockage was severe. If you had waited even 10 more minutes to get her here." He trailed off, the implication hanging in the sterile air. "Is she going to be okay?" I asked, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. Someone far stronger and more dangerous than the woman who had woken up this morning. "She's a fighter," the doctor replied with a small smile. "She kept whispering something about not wanting to be a bother. But she's stable for now." I thanked him and watched him walk away. I looked back down at the papers in my lap, the proof of Jonathan's greatest lie. My mother had given him everything because she believed in family. She believed that when you love someone, you protect them. Jonathan thought he was the hunter, the alpha realtor of Orange County. He thought my mother was a weak, disposable relic of a bygone era. He had no idea that he had just handed the director of audit and compliance a roadmap to his own destruction. I pulled out my phone. I didn't call Jonathan. I didn't text him to tell him her surgery was over. He didn't deserve that peace of mind. Instead, I opened my banking app and looked at our joint accounts. $80,000. That was the liquid cash we kept for emergencies. My thumb hovered over the transfer button. Not yet, I told myself, a dark, calculated smile touching my lips. A good auditor doesn't just take the money. They dismantle the entire system. I tucked the manila envelope securely into my own bag. I was going to sit by my mother's bed until she opened her eyes. And while she slept, I was going to start the most comprehensive audit of Jonathan Nelson's life. I was going to find every hidden cent, every forged signature, and every dirty secret he had buried under his self-made brand. He wanted to talk about burdens? By the time I was finished, the only thing he'd be carrying was a prison sentence. The hospital room was quiet, save for the rhythmic, mechanical chirp of the heart monitor. A sound that reminded me every second of how close I had come to losing the only person who truly loved me. My mother looked so small amidst the white linens, her hands, once so busy with gardening and baking, now still and bruised from IV lines. My sister Clara had arrived an hour ago, her face pale with a mix of exhaustion and fury. She was staying for the night shift, which gave me exactly what I needed: a window of time and a cold, dark house to begin the excavation of Jonathan Nelson's soul. I drove back to our Newport Beach estate, but I didn't feel like a homeowner. I felt like an investigator entering a crime scene. The house was dark, the air smelling faintly of the lemon wax my mother had used just hours before her heart nearly gave out. I walked past the designer furniture and the curated art, seeing them for what they were now: monuments to a theft. I went straight to my home office, sat down, and opened my laptop. The blue light of the screen reflected in my eyes, and for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't looking at a family budget. I was conducting a forensic audit of a fraud. I started with our joint high-yield savings account. This was the safety net, the $80,000 we had painstakingly built over years of my high-salary bonuses and mother's small contributions. I logged in, my breath catching in my throat. The balance didn't show $80,000. It showed $412.16. My blood turned to ice. I scrolled through the transaction history. Over the last 3 weeks, Jonathan had made 6 separate transfers to an offshore brokerage account I didn't recognize. He hadn't just dipped into our savings. He had liquidated our security while I was busy working 60-hour weeks to keep the Nelson Luxury brand afloat. But that was just the surface. As an auditor, I know that one lie is usually a curtain for 10 more. I pulled my mother's credit report next, using the power of attorney she'd given me years ago, just in case. What I found made me want to scream into the empty hallway. There were 3 black credit cards, the kind with no spending limits and astronomical fees, opened in Martha Wood's name within the last 6 months. The billing address wasn't our home. It was a P.O. box in Irvine that Jonathan used for business mail. He had stolen the identity of a retired school teacher to fund a lifestyle he couldn't afford. I sat back, the leather chair creaking in the silence. The $92,000 Range Rover he had been so protective of this morning? I found the financing paperwork in his digital trash folder. He had forged my signature as a cosigner and used my mother's ownership of her Santa Barbara home, a home she hadn't owned in 10 years, as collateral. He was playing a high-stakes game of musical chairs with our lives, and the music had just stopped. I realized then that Jonathan wasn't just a narcissist. He was a predator. He had seen my mother's kindness and my professional focus as a weakness to be exploited. He thought that because I dealt with numbers, I didn't see the people behind them. He was wrong. Numbers are the most honest thing in this world. They don't have egos. They don't make excuses. They just tell the truth. And the truth was that Jonathan Nelson was a bankrupt ghost living in a house built with a grandmother's sacrifice. I spent the next 4 hours downloading every statement, every forged document, and every suspicious wire transfer. I created a War Room folder on my encrypted drive, labeling it simply Project Exorcism. I felt a strange, chilling sense of clarity. The woman who had cried in the hospital parking lot was gone. The woman who remained was the director of audit and compliance. I wasn't just going to leave him. I was going to deconstruct him. I was going to peel back the luxury realtor veneer until there was nothing left but the small, insecure thief who had been hiding underneath all along. Just as I was about to close the laptop, a notification popped up on our shared calendar. It was an alert for tomorrow afternoon. Closing celebration, Sterling Group, the Pacific Club. Jonathan was planning to celebrate his big win with the very money he had stolen from my mother's heart. He expected me to be there, playing the role of the supportive, high-earning wife, smiling for the cameras while my mother lay in a hospital bed. I leaned forward, my fingers dancing over the keys. I didn't cancel the event. In fact, I sent a confirmation. If Jonathan wanted a closing, I was going to give him one he would never forget. He thought he was the master of the big reveal, the man who pulled the silk sheet off a multi-million-dollar property. Well, tomorrow, I was going to pull the sheet off his life, and I was going to do it in front of every person he ever tried to impress. "You called her a burden, Jonathan," I whispered to the empty room, my voice as sharp as a scalpel. "But you're about to find out exactly how heavy the truth can be." I closed the laptop and walked to the window, watching the moonlight hit the ocean in the distance. The audit was complete. Now, it was time for the enforcement. The 2 a.m. fog had rolled in from the Pacific, swallowing the palm trees and turning the Newport coastline into a ghost town. I drove my modest sedan, the one Jonathan always told me was bad for the brand, to a 24-hour Italian bistro in Costa Mesa. It was the kind of place where the espresso was strong and the booths were deep enough to hide a revolution. Marcus was already there, tucked into a corner table. As a federal prosecutor, he lived in a world of shadows and indictments. He looked at me, then at the thick, encrypted flash drive I placed on the table between us like a live grenade. "Nicole, you sounded different on the phone," Marcus said, his voice low and steady. "You said it was an emergency, but you didn't call the police. You called me." "Because the police see a domestic dispute, Marcus," I replied, my voice devoid of the warmth I usually reserve for family. I pushed the drive toward him. "But you see a paper trail. This isn't just about a marriage ending. This is an audit of a criminal enterprise." Marcus opened his laptop, plugged in the drive, and began to scroll. I watched his eyes. For the first 2 minutes, there was brother-in-law concern. By minute 5, his professional mask took over. His jaw tightened and a vein in his temple began to throb. "My God, Nicole," he whispered, staring at the screen. "He didn't just spend your savings. He used Martha's social security number to open 3 separate lines of credit. And these wire transfers to the offshore account, they're structured to avoid federal reporting limits. That's money laundering, or at least a very clumsy attempt at it." "There's more," I said, leaning in. "He used the Santa Barbara house, the one Mom sold 10 years ago to fund his business, as proof of assets for a $92,000 vehicle loan. He forged my signature on the cosigner agreement. Marcus, he's been using my credit score and my mother's identity to build a house of cards. And this morning, he left her on the sofa because he didn't want her germs in his car while she was having a heart attack." Marcus closed the laptop with a sharp thud that echoed in the quiet bistro. He looked at me with a cold, predatory intensity. In the state of California, financial elder abuse carries heavy sentencing, especially when combined with identity theft and wire fraud. Because he used a P.O. box across county lines and moved money into an offshore brokerage, this falls under my jurisdiction. This isn't a divorce, Nicole. This is a federal takedown. "How long?" I asked. "To do it right, to make sure he doesn't have a single loophole to crawl through?" "I need 48 hours, Marcus said. "I need to coordinate with the task force and get the warrant signed. But Nicole, you have to go back. You have to act like the good wife for 2 more days. If he suspects the audit director is on his trail, he'll liquidate that offshore account and disappear. Can you do that? Can you look at the man who tried to kill your mother and offer him a cup of coffee?" I thought about my mother, pale and fragile in that hospital bed. I thought about the beeswax on the floor and the look of pure disgust in Jonathan's eyes. A strange, terrifying calm washed over me. "I spent 10 years catching the smartest fraudsters in the country, Marcus," I said, my voice as sharp as a diamond. "I can handle one arrogant realtor who thinks he's the smartest person in the room. I won't just offer him coffee. I'll offer him the finest performance of my life." "Good," Marcus said, standing up and pocketing the drive. "Keep your phone on. I'm going to start the paperwork for the emergency protective order and the asset freeze. By Tuesday, the only thing Jonathan Nelson will own is the orange jumpsuit the feds give him." I walked out of the bistro and into the cold, damp California night. The fog was thick, but for the first time in a decade, I saw everything with perfect clarity. Jonathan thought he was a predator in a world of sheep. He had no idea he was a small-time thief who had accidentally robbed the one person who knew exactly how to put him in a cage. As I drove back to the mansion that was no longer a home, I practiced my smile in the rearview mirror. It was the smile of a woman who was perfectly fine, perfectly submissive, and perfectly ready to watch a kingdom burn. The audit was moving from the ledger to the courtroom, and Jonathan Nelson's debt to my family was about to be collected in full. The sunrise over Newport Beach was a cruel, brilliant gold, spilling across our kitchen island like liquid wealth. I sat there, cradling a mug of cold coffee, watching the dust motes dance in the light. In my professional world, we call this the quiet period. The moment before a financial bombshell is dropped, when the numbers are settled but the world doesn't know it yet. My mind was a whirlwind of the data Marcus and I had reviewed. It wasn't just that Jonathan had spent our money. He had systematically erased my mother's identity to forge his own. I went to his home office, a room filled with leather-bound books he never read and awards for top producer that now looked like participation trophies for a con artist. I didn't need a crowbar. I knew the code to his secure drawer. It was his own birthday, a classic narcissist mistake. When the drawer slid open, I found the physical evidence of his betrayal. There they were, 3 matte black credit cards tucked inside a velvet-lined box. I picked one up, my thumb running over my mother's name, Martha L. Wood. The weight of the card felt like lead in my hand. He hadn't just stolen her money. He was spending her reputation, her decades of perfect credit, and the very name she had worked so hard to keep honorable as a teacher. Beside the cards was a folder containing the Range Rover's registration. I opened it and saw the Nicole Wood signature at the bottom. It was good. He'd practiced. He'd mimicked the way I loop my N and the sharp tail of my E. But as an auditor, I saw the hesitation in the ink, the slight tremor of a man who knew he was committing a felony. He hadn't just forged a name, he had forged a life. He had turned our marriage into a fraudulent contract. I took high-resolution photos of every page, my hands steady, my heart as cold as a morgue. The sound of the garage door rumbling open sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. I quickly replaced the files, locked the drawer, and slipped back into the kitchen just as Jonathan walked in. He looked rumpled, his expensive linen suit wrinkled from a night of celebrating at the club. He smelled of high-end bourbon and the desperation of a man trying to outrun his own debts. He didn't ask about my mother. He didn't ask if she'd survived the night. Instead, he walked straight to the espresso machine. "Hard night at the hospital, babe?" he asked, his back to me. His voice was casual, as if he were asking about a trip to the grocery store. "I hope you didn't spend too much on the private room. We need to be smart with our cash flow this month, especially with the sterling closing today. Image is everything, Nicole. We can't look like we're struggling." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the thinning hair he spent thousands to hide, the sweat on his brow, and the hollow glint in his eyes. He was a parasite in a designer shell. I forced my lips into a thin, weary smile. "She's stable, Jonathan. The doctor said she's a fighter. And don't worry about the money. I've been looking into our accounts. I think I have a very clear picture of where we stand." He stiffened for a fraction of a second, the steam from the espresso machine masking his reaction. "Good. That's why I married a numbers girl. You keep the books, I keep the clients happy. It's a winning team." He turned around, flashing that blinding, fake realtor smile that had fooled me for a decade. "I'm going to go get cleaned up for the Sterling luncheon. It's at the Pacific Club at noon. I expect you there, Nicole. In that navy dress I like. We need to look like the power couple of Orange County." "Oh, I'll be there, Jonathan," I said, my voice dropping to a low, melodic hum. "I wouldn't miss it for the world. It's going to be a very big day for our family. A day of total transparency." He laughed, a shallow, arrogant sound, and headed upstairs, leaving me in the silence of the kitchen. He thought he was in control. He thought he could spend the morning prepping his brand, while I sat in the corner like a loyal auditor. He had no idea that while he was showering, I was sending a secure link of those photos to Marcus, and a theft of identity report to every major credit bureau. He had spent months carefully building this trap for my mother and me, but he'd forgotten one thing. When you're dealing with an auditor, the truth doesn't just come out. It arrives with an invoice. I looked at the beeswax-polished floor one last time before going to change. My mother had worked so hard to make this house shine, to make it a home for a man who didn't deserve her shadow. Today, I wasn't just Nicole the wife, or Nicole the daughter. I was the collector, and Jonathan Nelson's bill was finally due. The Pacific Club in Newport Beach is where the old money of Orange County comes to look down on the new money, and Jonathan was determined to prove he belonged to the former. The air was thick with the scent of expensive sea salt air, polished mahogany, and the kind of perfume that costs more than a month's rent for most people. I sat at the head table, draped in the navy silk dress Jonathan had demanded I wear. It was my armor. Beside me, Jonathan was a whirlwind of practiced charisma. He laughed too loudly at the jokes of the Sterling Group executives, his hand resting possessively on my shoulder, as if I were just another trophy on his mantle. "The secret to real estate," Jonathan told the table, his voice carrying that smooth salesman's lilt that used to make me feel safe, "is understanding legacy. You aren't just selling 4 walls and a roof. You're selling the American dream. You're selling the foundation for the next generation." I felt a sickening jolt in my stomach. Legacy. This was the man who had traded my mother's childhood home, our family's actual foundation, for a down payment on a lifestyle he couldn't afford. He was talking about foundations while he was actively burying my mother under the weight of his fraud. "And of course," Jonathan added, squeezing my shoulder, I couldn't do any of it without my brilliant wife. Nicole keeps me grounded. She's the one who makes sure the numbers always add up. The table murmured with polite approval. I looked at Mr. Sterling, a man whose net worth was calculated in the billions, and forced myself to tilt my head and smile. It was the smile of a woman who was perfectly content, perfectly supportive, and secretly counting down the seconds until his world exploded. The numbers always tell a story, don't they, Jonathan? I said, my voice low and steady. I picked up my crystal water glass, the ice clinking like a countdown. Sometimes they even tell a story about things we thought were long forgotten, like old investments or hidden debts. Jonathan's smile faltered for a millisecond, the kind of microscopic glitch only an auditor would catch. He tightened his grip on his wine glass. Nicole is always so analytical, he laughed, though the sound was hollow. Always looking for the hidden meaning in everything. It's a gift, I replied, turning my gaze back to the executives. And a curse. Once you see the pattern of a lie, you can't unsee it. It's like a thread in a cheap suit. You pull it, and the whole thing just unravels. For a moment, the tension at the table was so thick you could have cut it with a steak knife. Jonathan's eyes flashed with a warning, a silent command for me to get back in line. He hated it when I showed my intelligence in front of his peers. He wanted a decoration, not a director of audit. But then, his phone buzzed on the table. Then it buzzed again, and again. He glanced down, his brow furrowing. He tried to hide the screen, but I saw the notifications from the corner of my eye. Alert. High-risk activity on account ending in 4022. Alert. Identity verification required. Alert. Insurance policy cancellation. The color drained from his face, replaced by a pasty, grayish hue that reminded me of my mother on the sofa. He reached for his wine, his hand trembling just enough to make the liquid swirl violently in the glass. "Is everything okay, darling?" I asked, my voice dripping with mock concern. I leaned in close, so close I could smell the expensive bourbon from his celebration the night before. "You look like you've seen a ghost, or perhaps an unexpected invoice?" "Just a minor technical glitch at the office," he hissed under his breath, his fake smile plastered back on like a cracked mask. "Excuse me for a moment, gentlemen. A realtor's work never stops." He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, a breach of etiquette that made Mr. Sterling raise an eyebrow. Jonathan hurried toward the hallway, his steps frantic, his alpha persona crumbling with every yard he gained. I sat there, calm and composed, sipping my water. I knew exactly what he was finding. He was finding that his black cards were now pieces of useless plastic. He was finding that the Range Rover he loved more than my mother's life was officially uninsured. And he was finding that the audit director he thought he had domesticated was currently dismantling his life from a luncheon table. "He's a very busy man," Mr. Sterling remarked, looking at the door where Jonathan had disappeared. "He is," I agreed, setting my glass down with a soft click. "But he's about to find himself with a lot of free time. Very, very soon." I looked out the window at the Pacific Ocean. The tide was coming in, and Jonathan Nelson was standing on a sandcastle. The perfect mask had served its purpose. Now, it was time to let the water take him under. The murmur of the Pacific Club luncheon continued around me like the hum of a distant machine. To the Sterling Group executives, I was merely the composed, supportive wife of a high-flying realtor. They saw the navy silk and the pearls. They didn't see the scalpel I was holding under the table. As Jonathan's chair stood empty, I pulled out my phone. In the world of high-level auditing, there is a concept called risk mitigation. When a system is compromised by fraud, you don't just patch the leak. You cut off the oxygen. You isolate the corrupted cell so it can no longer drain the host. Jonathan was the corruption, and this club, this car, and this brand were the host he was feeding on. I stepped away from the table for a moment, moving toward the stone balcony that overlooked the valet circle. Down below, Jonathan's white Range Rover sat prominently in the gold-tier parking spot, gleaming under the California sun. It was a $92,000 monument to identity theft, I hit a speed dial number I'd saved an hour ago. "This is Nicole Wood," I said, my voice dropping into the flat, professional tone I used when testifying before a board of directors. "I'm calling regarding policy 88-Delta-9er, the white Range Rover registered under Martha Wood and Nicole Wood. I am calling to report a material misrepresentation in the initial filing. The primary driver, Jonathan Nelson, is not an authorized user, and the vehicle was obtained through fraudulent identity use. I am exercising my right as the primary cosigner to cancel the binder, effective immediately. Yes, right now. Remove the liability coverage. Log the fraud report. Thank you." Click. One artery severed. Without insurance, the financing agreement for a luxury lease in the state of California becomes a default trigger. But I wasn't done. I dialed the second number, West Coast Asset Recovery. "I have a tip on a vehicle flagged for identity fraud collateral," I told the dispatcher. "It's currently at the Pacific Club, Newport Beach. Valet Circle. The signatures on the financing are forged, and the primary lender has already been notified of the fraud status. If you want the recovery fee, your truck needs to be here in 15 minutes. Ask for the Nelson vehicle." I leaned against the cool stone railing, watching the valet attendants buffing the hoods of Ferraris and Bentleys. Jonathan had spent 10 years trying to convince these people he was one of them. He thought that by putting my mother's worthless money into a German-engineered engine, he had bought his way into the elite. He didn't understand that the elite don't build their lives on forged signatures. They build them on power, and I was the one holding the power grid. I walked back into the dining room just as Jonathan was returning from the hallway. He looked like a man who had just seen his own ghost. His skin was sallow, and his eyes were darting around the room as if looking for an exit that didn't exist. He'd clearly tried to use his black card to pay a pre-authorized deposit for the next event, only to find the declined message staring back at him. He sank into his chair, his breathing shallow. He tried to reach for his wine, but his hand was shaking so violently that the crystal clinked against his teeth. "Everything all right, Jonathan?" I asked, my voice a soothing, deadly silk. "You look a bit over-leveraged." "The bank. There's a mistake," he hissed, leaning in so the Sterling executives wouldn't hear. "Some sort of security freeze on all the accounts, even the business line. Nicole, you need to call your contact at Chase, now. I have a $2,000 luncheon bill to settle, and the card is bouncing like a rubber ball." "A mistake?" I tilted my head, looking at him with mock curiosity. "That's strange. I ran a compliance check this morning, and the numbers seemed very clear to me. It seems the system has identified a high-risk entity associated with our names. When that happens, the protocol is to freeze everything to prevent further loss of assets." "What are you talking about? What protocol?" His voice was rising, a note of hysteria creeping in. "The protocol of justice, Jonathan," I whispered, leaning closer until I could see the sweat beads forming on his upper lip. "You remember what you said this morning? That Mom was a burden who sucked the life out of the house? Well, I realized you were right about one thing. There was a parasite in our home. But it wasn't the woman who sold her house to fund your career. It was the man who stole her name because he was too small to build his own." Jonathan's eyes went wide. He looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. Not as his numbers girl, but as his executioner. You did this?" he stammered. I didn't answer. Instead, I pointed toward the large arched window that overlooked the valet circle. The sound of a heavy diesel engine rumbled through the pristine air of the club, a jarring, industrial noise that didn't belong in this world of silk and Chardonnay. A massive matte black tow truck with asset recovery stenciled on the side swung into the driveway. The dining room went silent as the guests watched the tow driver hop out, check a clipboard, and begin hooking the chains to the front axle of the gleaming white Range Rover. "Jonathan," Mr. Sterling said, his voice booming in the quiet room. "Isn't that your car? What on earth is happening?" Jonathan stood up, his face turning a shade of purple I'd never seen before. He looked at the window, then at the executives, then at me. He was a man watching his skin being peeled off in public. I'm sure there's a misunderstanding," Jonathan shouted, his voice cracking. "I'll handle it. It's just a clerical error with the dealership." He scrambled away from the table, nearly knocking over a waiter. He ran toward the exit, his expensive Italian loafers clicking frantically on the floor. I stayed exactly where I was, picked up my fork, and took a small, deliberate bite of the seared sea bass. "The fish is excellent, Mr. Sterling," I said calmly. "You really must try the reduction." The oxygen was gone. The image was dead. Now, all that was left was the cold, hard reality of the audit. Do you think I should have given him a chance to explain? Or did he lose that right the moment he left my mother on that sofa? Write "justice" in the comments if you're Team Nicole. Don't forget to like the video to support Martha's recovery. The glass doors of the Pacific Club swung open with a violent thud as Jonathan burst out onto the portico, his face a frantic mask of sweat and desperation. Behind him, the Sterling Group executives and half the dining room had trickled out toward the balcony, their curiosity piqued by the uncharacteristic chaos unfolding in the sanctuary of Newport Beach's elite. Down in the valet circle, the scene was a brutal contrast to the manicured hedges and soft jazz of the club. Mike, a burly tow truck driver with grease-stained sleeves, was expertly tightening the heavy metal winches onto the front axle of the white Range Rover. The hydraulic whine of the truck echoed off the stone walls, sounding like a funeral dirge for Jonathan's reputation. Hey, stop that right now!" Jonathan screamed, his voice cracking as he stumbled down the stairs. "Do you have any idea who I am? That's my car. I'm Jonathan Nelson. There's been a mistake, a massive clerical error." The driver didn't even look up until the chains were secure. He spat a piece of gum onto the pristine asphalt and checked his electronic clipboard. "I don't care if you're the King of England, pal. I've got a repossession order for a vehicle used as collateral under a fraudulent identity. The insurance is voided, and the lender wants their asset back before it disappears. My orders come from the bank and the state of California." "Fraudulent?" Mr. Sterling's voice boomed from the top of the stairs, cold and sharp. He was looking down at Jonathan with the kind of expression one reserved for a cockroach found in a five-star meal. "Jonathan, did that man just say your car is tied to identity fraud?" Jonathan spun around, his hands trembling as he tried to adjust his tie. No, Mr. Sterling, please, it's my mother-in-law. She's elderly, she's confused. She must have called the bank in a fit of dementia after her heart attack. I'll have it sorted by the end of the day, I swear." I stepped out from behind the executives, my heels clicking softly on the stone. The sun was high now, casting long, unforgiving shadows. I didn't look at Jonathan with anger. I looked at him with the clinical detachment of a surgeon removing a tumor. "She wasn't confused this morning, Jonathan," I said, my voice carrying perfectly in the sudden silence of the driveway. "She was dying on our sofa, and while she was struggling for air, you were worried about her germs on these seats. Seats that, as it turns out, were paid for with her stolen credit and my forged name." The crowd gasped. In this world, social faux pas are one thing, but financial impropriety, especially elder abuse, is the ultimate sin. Jonathan's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He reached into his jacket, pulling out his wallet with shaking fingers. I'll just pay the recovery fee," he stuttered, turning back to the driver. "How much? 500? 1,000? Just take it off the hitch. I'll give you cash." "It's not about the fee anymore, sir," Mike said, climbing into the cab of his truck. "The car is flagged. It's gone." At that moment, Mr. Henderson, the club's general manager, stepped forward. He was holding a small silver tray with a leather-bound folder. The bill for the Sterling luncheon. "Mr. Nelson," Henderson said, his voice dripping with professional frost. "Since you are departing so abruptly, we'll need to settle the afternoon's tab. $2,200, including the wine service." Jonathan grabbed his black card, the one with my mother's name on the hidden file, and shoved it at Henderson. "Just run it. Run it and get out of my face." Henderson slid the card through the mobile reader. A sharp, high-pitched beep echoed in the air. "Declined, sir," Henderson said, his eyebrows rising a fraction of an inch. "Try the other one," Jonathan hissed, pulling out a second card. Beep. Declined. The third card. Beep. Declined. Jonathan was sweating through his linen suit now, the expensive fabric clinging to his back in dark, ugly patches. He looked around at the faces of the men he had spent years trying to impress. They weren't looking at a power player anymore. They were looking at a pathetic, broke little man who couldn't even pay for his own lunch. "Nicole," he whispered, turning to me, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. "Nicole, honey, give me your card, just for a second. I'll pay you back tonight. Don't do this here. Don't embarrass me like this." I walked down the last 3 steps until I was standing inches from him. I could see the panic in his pupils, the way his charisma had evaporated to reveal the hollow core beneath. I reached into my bag, but I didn't pull out a credit card. I pulled out a $20 bill and handed it to the valet who was standing nearby. "That's for the trouble," I told the young man. Then I turned to Jonathan. "I'm not your numbers girl anymore, Jonathan, and I'm certainly not your bank. You told me this morning that my mother was a burden. You said you didn't have time for people who couldn't take care of themselves." I leaned in, my voice a whisper that felt like a blade. "Well, you don't have a car, you don't have a cent, and in about 10 minutes, you won't even have a reputation. You're the burden now. And like you said, I've got work to do. Figure it out yourself." I turned my back on him and walked toward the street where a black car was already waiting for me. Sent by Marcus. Behind me, the tow truck roared to life and began to pull away, dragging Jonathan's pride down the driveway with a loud, metallic scrape. "Nicole! Nicole, you can't leave me here!" he screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of the Sterling executives turning their backs and walking back into the club to discuss who would take over his listings. Jonathan Nelson was left standing in the sun, holding 3 pieces of useless plastic, in a club where he was no longer welcome, with a bill he couldn't pay. The big reveal was over, and the audit was just getting started. The walk from the Pacific Club entrance to the curb felt like a mile-long gauntlet of judgment. Jonathan stood there, the salt air mocking him, clutching his phone like a lifeline. He tried to call a private car service, the kind that usually arrived in 5 minutes, to whisk him to his next multi-million-dollar showing. But the app immediately flagged his account for payment failure. With no choice and his face burning a shade of crimson that clashed with his linen suit, he was forced to call a basic rideshare. When a dented beige sedan from 2012 pulled up, driven by a man named Gary who was blasting classic rock and eating a sandwich, Jonathan looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. "Rough day at the office, pal?" Gary asked, looking at Jonathan's disheveled state in the rearview mirror. Jonathan didn't answer. He just stared out the window as they drove through the winding, flower-lined streets of Newport Coast. He was already rehearsing his apology, or rather, his manipulation. He would tell Nicole he'd been under immense pressure. He'd blame the accounting errors on a rogue assistant. He'd even visit Martha in the hospital, maybe bring some expensive flowers, paid for with a card he hoped would magically work by then. He was a salesman after all. He could sell ice to an Eskimo. Surely he could sell his regret to a wife who had loved him for a decade. But as the beige sedan turned onto our street, Jonathan's rehearsed speech died in his throat. From a block away, he could see them. A row of heavy-duty black industrial trash bags lined up neatly on the manicured lawn of our Mediterranean villa. They looked like oversized crows perched on the pristine grass. Gary slowed the car to a crawl, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Looks like someone's moving out in a hurry, the driver chuckled. Jonathan didn't wait for the car to fully stop. He threw a $20 bill, the very last of the cash he'd tucked into his pocket weeks ago, at Gary and scrambled out of the car. He ran to the first bag and ripped it open. A shower of silk and cashmere spilled out onto the sidewalk. These were his pride and joy. His custom-made Italian suits, his limited edition silk ties, and the hand-stitched vest that my mother, Martha, had spent hours meticulously mending and pressing, so he would never look anything less than a king. Now they were crumpled, smelling of the lemon-scented trash bags he used to complain were too cheap for this house. He tore into the next bag, finding his $500 leather shoes and his collection of vanity trophies. Everything he used to build the Jonathan Nelson brand was sitting on the curb like Sunday morning refuse. "Nicole! Nicole, open this damn door!" he roared, sprinting up the stone steps to the grand oak entrance. He punched his birthday, the code he'd used for 5 years, into the digital keypad. The lock emitted a long, low, mocking beep, and a red light flashed. He tried again, his fingers trembling so much he hit the wrong numbers. Beep, red light. He hammered his fist against the solid wood, the sound echoing through the quiet, wealthy neighborhood. "Nicole, you can't do this. This is my house. My name is on the title." He was wrong, of course. My name, and my mother's name, through the Santa Barbara equity transfer, was on the title. He was merely the tenant of a lie. Just as he was about to kick the door, he noticed a crisp, white envelope taped at eye level, sealed with a red official business stamp. He ripped it open, his eyes darting across the legalese. It was an emergency protective order, signed by a judge less than 2 hours ago, citing financial elder abuse and identity theft. Below it was a notice of eviction and asset freeze. The words federal investigation and lien jumped off the page like physical blows. The document stated that he was legally barred from coming within 100 yards of me or my mother, and that his presence on this property was now considered criminal trespass. "No, no, no, no," he whimpered, sliding down the door frame until he was sitting on the very porch my mother had polished with beeswax just 24 hours earlier. At that moment, the Ring doorbell camera above his head whistled, the sound it makes when someone is watching the live feed. Jonathan looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his hair matted with sweat. He looked directly into the lens, hoping to see a glimmer of the soft wife he thought he could always control. "Nicole, honey, I know you're watching," he pleaded, trying to summon one last bit of that realtor charm. "I made a mistake. I was scared about the market. I did it for us, for our future. Think about everything we've built. You can't throw 10 years away because of a few credit cards. Let me in and we'll fix this. We'll get your mom the best care money can buy. Just give me the code." The speaker on the doorbell crackled to life, but it wasn't my voice that answered. It was the cold, gravelly tone of Marcus, the federal prosecutor. "Mr. Nelson," Marcus said, his voice amplified so loudly it likely reached the neighbor's ears. "I am currently inside the residence with a team from the Financial Crimes Task Force. We are executing a search warrant for your home office. Every forged document, every offshore routing number, and every piece of evidence of your identity theft is currently being logged into federal evidence. If you do not vacate this porch in the next 60 seconds, the Newport Beach Police Department, who are currently idling at the end of the block, will arrest you for violating a court-ordered EPO." Jonathan froze. He looked toward the end of the street and saw the black and white cruiser slowly beginning its approach. The reality finally hit him, not like a wave, but like a mountain. The power couple was a myth. The luxury brand was a crime scene. And the woman he had called a burden was the only person who had ever truly protected him from the man he actually was. He stood up, his legs shaking, and looked at the black trash bags one last time. He grabbed a single suit jacket, the one Martha had mended just last week, and tried to drape it over his arm, but it slipped, falling into a puddle of irrigation water from the sprinklers. He didn't stop to pick it up. He turned and began to walk away, a homeless man in a $1,000 suit, leaving his stolen life behind him in plastic bags. The audit was no longer just about the money. It was about the complete and total eviction of the parasite from our family's history. The glass and steel towers of Irvine's financial district shimmered in the late afternoon sun, looking like cold, indifferent monuments to the wealth Jonathan had so desperately tried to fake. He had spent his last $20 on a bus pass and a bottle of water, his $1,000 suit now stained with the salt and grime of a man who had spent the last 3 hours wandering the streets of Orange County. He arrived at my corporate headquarters, the nerve center of audit and compliance, looking like a frantic ghost. He bypassed the security desk, using his expired spouse's badge before the system could fully revoke it, and rode the elevator to the penthouse floor. When the doors opened, he didn't find the soft, grieving wife he expected. He found a phalanx of legal reality. I was standing in the center of the executive lobby, framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Pacific. Beside me stood Marcus and 2 men in dark suits with federal agent badges clipped to their belts. Jonathan stopped dead, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thin for him to breathe. "Nicole," he gasped, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "You have to listen to me. I went to the house. I saw the bags. I saw the papers. It's a misunderstanding. I was trying to leverage our assets to survive the market dip. I did it for us. I did it so we wouldn't lose the lifestyle you've grown accustomed to." I walked toward him, my heels echoing against the polished granite floor with the precision of a ticking clock. I didn't stop until I was inches from him. I didn't see a husband. I didn't see a partner. I saw a line item that needed to be deleted. "The lifestyle I grew accustomed to, Jonathan?" I asked, my voice a low, terrifyingly calm hum. "You mean the lifestyle my mother paid for with her blood? The one she funded by selling the only thing she had left of her own parents?" I reached into the leather portfolio I was carrying and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a high-resolution copy of the 2014 deed to the Santa Barbara house. I didn't hand it to him. I dropped it on the floor at his feet. "You told me your business was built on vision and grit," I said, the words sharp as a scalpel. "But this paper says it was built on a lie. You took $250,000 from a woman who trusted you. You promised her you'd protect me, and then you used that money to buy a Range Rover you wouldn't even let her sit in. You isn't a self-made millionaire, Jonathan. You're a thief who mistook a grandmother's kindness for a blank check." Jonathan looked down at the paper, then back at me, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. She gave me that money. It was a private agreement. You can't prove it was a theft." "I don't have to," I replied, a cold smile touching my lips. The audit was never about the loan. It was about the identity theft. It was about the 3 black cards you opened in her name. It was about the forged signatures on the Range Rover lease. And most importantly, it was about the wire transfers to your offshore brokerage account that Marcus here has already traced back to our joint savings. Marcus stepped forward, his expression as hard as a prison wall. "Mr. Nelson, my office has spent the last 6 hours reviewing the data provided by the Director of Audit. We have physical evidence of identity fraud, wire fraud, and financial elder abuse. Because you crossed county lines to open those P.O. boxes and used international wire transfers, you are now facing federal charges under the RICO Act and the Elder Abuse Prevention and Prosecution Act." The color left Jonathan's face entirely. He looked at the federal agents, then back at me. "Nicole, please. If I go to prison, you lose everything too. The house, the reputation, the Sterling account, it all goes away. Think about your mother. Do you want her to see her son-in-law in handcuffs? Do you want her sacrifice to be for nothing?" "My mother's sacrifice was for me," I whispered, leaning in so only he could hear. "And today, I am honoring that sacrifice by cleaning the rot out of her house." You aren't a part of this family anymore, Jonathan. You're just a bad debt that I'm finally writing off. One of the federal agents stepped forward, the metallic clink of handcuffs breaking the silence of the executive suite. Jonathan Nelson, you are under arrest for federal financial crimes, the agent said. As they turned him around and pulled his hands behind his back, Jonathan finally broke. The alpha realtor was gone. The power player was dead. He began to sob, ugly, desperate sounds that echoed through the lobby. He begged for mercy, for a professional courtesy, for one last chance to explain. As they led him toward the elevator, he looked back at me, his face twisted in a mask of pathetic betrayal. How could you do this? After 10 years, how could you be so cold? I watched the elevator doors begin to close, the light reflecting off the silver cuffs on his wrists. I thought about my mother's labored breathing on that velvet sofa. I thought about the beeswax on the floor and the look of disgust he'd given her. I learned it from you, Jonathan, I said, my voice echoing through the closing gap. I'm just taking care of the business. Figure it out yourself. The doors hissed shut. The audit was over. The liability had been removed. I turned back to the window, watching the sun finally dip below the horizon of the Pacific. For the first time in a decade, the air in the room felt clean. 6 months later, the California sun felt different. No longer a harsh spotlight on a fraudulent life, but a warm, steady glow over a new beginning. I stood in the lobby of a refurbished colonial building in Santa Barbara, not far from where my mother's ancestral home once stood. The air here smelled of jasmine and sea salt, a fragrance that felt like peace. On the glass front door, gold lettering caught the light. The Self-Reliant Legacy Foundation. Inside, the room was buzzing with the kind of energy you only find when purpose meets passion. Tables were set up with laptops and ledgers, and at the head of the main table sat my mother, Martha. She looked 10 years younger. The gray pallor of that terrible Sunday morning was gone, replaced by a vibrant bloom in her cheeks. She was wearing a smart cream-colored suit, one she'd bought with her own money, and she was currently explaining the basics of credit monitoring to a group of 20 seniors. You see, she told them, her voice clear and authoritative. Your name is the only thing you truly own. Never let anyone, not even family, tell you that protecting your financial health is a burden. It is your dignity. The applause that followed brought a lump to my throat. After Jonathan's arrest, the legal battle had been swift and brutal. Marcus had done a masterful job. Because we had acted so quickly to freeze the assets, we managed to recover nearly 60% of what Jonathan had funneled into the offshore accounts. Combined with the restitution ordered by the court and the sale of the Newport mansion, which I was more than happy to leave behind, my mother finally had her security back. But she didn't choose to sit on a beach. She chose to fight. She used the recovered funds to start this nonprofit, dedicated to teaching seniors how to spot financial abuse and protect their legacies. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a beacon. As for Jonathan, the alpha realtor, was now known as inmate number 74209 at a federal correctional facility. His brand had been stripped down to a prison jumpsuit. He tried to write me letters at first, filled with the same old manipulations, but I never opened them. I didn't need to. The audit was closed. The debt had been settled. My own life had transformed as well. Last month, I was promoted to Chief Strategic Risk Officer at my firm. My specialty? Identifying internal parasites, the kind of fraud that hides behind a smile and a wedding ring. I'm no longer the woman who failed to audit her own marriage. I'm the woman who ensures no one else has to go through that betrayal alone. That evening, the three of us, Mom, Clara, and I, gathered for dinner at my new home, a modest but beautiful cottage with a view of the mountains. There was no marble, no gilded mirrors, and no $3,000 suits in the closet. Just us. My mother insisted on cooking. As she set a steaming dish of her famous pot roast on the table, she stopped and looked at me. She reached out, her hand steady and strong, and squeezed mine. Thank you, Nicole. she whispered, for seeing me when I couldn't even see myself. You were never invisible, Mom, I replied. He just didn't have the eyes to see what true strength looked like. We sat down to eat, the sound of laughter filling the room. The silence that used to be heavy with Jonathan's ego was now light, airy, and full of hope. The American dream isn't about the cars you drive or the clubs you belong to. It's about the work you do, the people you protect, and the integrity you carry when no one is looking. Justice was served, not because we were lucky, but because we refused to be silent. We reclaimed our names, our money, and most importantly, our peace of mind. Thank you for walking this journey with me and my mother. Justice was served because we refused to be victims. What would you have done if you found out your partner was using your family's sacrifice against them? Would you have stayed quiet to save face? Or would you have started the audit? Share your thoughts below. I read every single one of them. And if you enjoyed this story of strength and justice, please subscribe for more. See you in the next one.